I believe we need a systematic approach to looking at historical responsibility and two major kinds of costs that arise from the history of emissions. One is the adaptation costs to adjust to a warming climate, and the other is for the losses and damages that are incurred even after optimum adjustment and adaptation spending is made.
For coming here today. I want to thank you personally. This is a very important topic to me and, of course, to everyone here on the panel. My name is Regina Valdez, and I'm going to discuss the topic of climate reparations. And I'm not going to use a sanitized phrase that is so often used, loss and damages. I really came to speak about reparations. And some of you may think that I've come here with answers, and I really promise you I don't have answers. But what I do have is I have questions. And my main question is, what is owed? Okay? And I want to know, to the 30 Indian farmers who commit suicide every day, to the 60,000 Indian farmer suicides that are directly linked to global warming, what is owed? What is owed to that farmer in India who couldn't pay his loan for the seed that he bought, and so therefore took the ultimate act of taking his life, leaving his wife and children destitute? What is owed to the 33 million people that have felt the effects of the deadly floods in Pakistan, which have killed more than 1,000 people and displaced nearly 8 million people since June? What is owed to the people of Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, these people who are seeing their 3-month dry season extended to up to 6 months or more? They can't even grow the food on which they have been subsisting for generations, causing millions to be without food, to be food insecure, to be driven to such desperation that they are taking long, dangerous treks towards North America, to the United States, away from their homes in Central America. What is owed to them? What is owed to those families? And I don't want to forget the 3 billion non-human animals who were killed or seriously wounded in the Australian wildfires of 2019. How could we ever forget that? Wombats, koalas, kangaroos, these are mammals just like you and me. Do we think they don't feel pain, that they don't love their offspring, the very offspring that they nurse just like we do? Is their suffering inconsequential? And to them, what is owed? So I did a little reading today, and I saw there's this website that keeps track of COVID deaths on a daily basis. Today marks 6,610,399 COVID deaths worldwide. Now, that's a lot of deaths in less than 3 years. But the thing is, there are between 8 to 10 million people who die every single solitary year directly because of the burning of fossil fuels. Do we not see something strange here? Every year, do those 8 million lives mean nothing? When we say we care about public health, what public? What public are we speaking about? When we have a number of people, 8 million dying every year, that's a New York City metropolitan area dying every year. Do we care? Why is it that we pay $530 billion in fossil fuel subsidies every year? We were able, my country, United States, to spend $5 trillion in stimulus dollars in 2021. But we were only able to spend a fraction of that for climate subsidies. It's too expensive. We can't afford it. We don't have the money. How can this be? How can it be that the United States has 4% of the world's population, yet has emitted 25% of the CO2 in the atmosphere? 4% of the world's population is responsible for 25% of the world's devastation. I want to know what is owed. I want to know how it is that the city that I live in can spend $4 billion on the Oculus Transit Hub in downtown New York City and not help pay at least that much in climate reparations. I will stop with that, and I want to introduce my first speaker. That's Paul Beckwith. He's a climate science educator. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Regina. So we have a huge case of inequality here. We know that the world's industrialized countries actually grew because of their access to cheap energy through the burning of fossil fuels. And if you go back in history a little bit further, it was also through slavery, cheap labor. If you just look at the US, for example, cities in the South and people in the South were very, very wealthy, on the backs of slavery. So we got rid of human-to-human slavery, but we still, in a way, we're all slaves to fossil fuels and the fossil fuel industry at the moment. We rely on it completely, and fossil fuel companies are the wealthiest companies in the world, and they run the show in a lot of cases. They're more powerful than government. So we need to get away from that. Now, in terms of this tsunami of climate impacts, why are they happening? These impacts are happening because of the warming, but even more so because of the non-uniform warming. So when we hear that, well, we're going to be 2.6 degrees Celsius by 2100 with the pledges that we've had right now, other models say 3 degrees, 4 degrees. Those are global average temperatures. Nobody lives with a global average temperature. We all live in certain regions, and the land is warming at double the rate the global average is warming. If you live at elevation, at an altitude, you're warming at double the rate that people are warming at sea level. If you're at a high latitude, you're warming 3 or 4 times or even 5 times faster than the global warming average. So this is creating a lot of contrast, a lot of variation in temperature rise geographically. And that contrast between, say, the land and the ocean, between the north, high latitudes, and the south, with mountain ranges and the topography of the Earth, we're getting very, very bizarre weather patterns happening because the jet streams are behaving completely differently. They're slowing, they're getting stuck in place. We're getting what meteorologists call blocking patterns that cause these extreme weather events to increase in frequency, severity, and duration. So the Earth warming is turbocharged, but the variability is much, much worse. And we're also getting lots of whiplashing from droughts to floods to droughts. So this is happening around the planet. I think that we have to be careful because for reparations, I think the reason why the West and rich countries are waking up to climate disasters is because they're getting a lot more of them happening themselves, especially in the US, Southwest, for example. So they're getting very concerned about the extreme weather events because they're suffering themselves. It's not just out of the goodness of their hearts that they want to decide suddenly to help the global south after they haven't done so for such a long time.
Thank you so much for that, Paul. And I couldn't agree more. It's not until, these catastrophes started hitting home that we began to wake up. And I'd like to turn it now to Dr. Lisa Dale of Columbia University. Dr. Lisa Dale is co-director of the undergraduate program in sustainable development.
Thanks. So I thought I would focus my remarks on teasing apart the difference between loss and damage, which I've heard a great deal about at this COP, and reparations. They're different. The terms are often used synonymously, but they actually reflect different principles. They signify different harms, and therefore they require different approaches and different solutions. So I'm going to walk through what we mean by loss and damage pretty quickly, where the gaps are in loss and damage, and how reparations, the notion of reparations, adds to that concept. So when we talk about loss and damage, we're using what's called the polluter pays principle, right? And this is pretty intuitive. The big polluters, be they fossil fuel companies or the wealthier industrialized countries, emitted the most greenhouse gases over time, became wealthy in the process of doing that, and therefore should pay for the damages that have been incurred. That's pretty intuitive. And this is really the root of the UNFCCC, why we're here, which is also founded on the common but differentiated responsibility principle, which lays out at the very beginning in the 1990s that countries have a common problem called climate change, but differentiated responsibility for addressing it. And that differentiated responsibility cuts across two different dimensions. One is different historical responsibility for emitting gases, and the other is different capacity today to respond. So we have a loss and damage concept that's rooted heavily in the founding of the UNFCCC and the way we approach climate change now. We've made some exciting progress, I think, here at COP27 on loss and damage, but there are some significant gaps. Most importantly, loss and damage is mostly restricted to monetary damages that can be quantified. So we can measure the value of the infrastructure that is destroyed by increasing natural disasters, for example. We can tally those up and begin to craft strategies for holding polluters accountable, for paying for those damages, especially in countries that are lower capacity and lower income. There are some big gaps in this notion of loss and damage that the concept of reparations perhaps allows us to consider. Most importantly, we can think about those along two dimensions, which are temporal and spatial. So temporally, time-wise, loss and damage is very focused on the today. This damage is happening now. We can measure what has happened already, so it's a little bit of the recent past and the near future. But what about future generations? That's something that loss and damage is unable to really account for. We can't quite know what the monetary cost will be in future generations. But we also need to look back into past generations and understand that the wealth that was accumulated by the now powerful, wealthy countries not only came from burning greenhouse gases, but came from patterns of colonialism and exploitation. And those kinds of harms are also not captured in loss and damage. The idea of reparations is much broader. So when we think about reparations, they offer us a different way of thinking about what we call reparative justice. And reparative justice is much more complex than I think loss and damage can be. And the principle goes beyond financial compensation and has to do with righting wrongs. And it's a principle that comes out of philosophy, and many great philosophers have opined about what we mean by reparative justice. But importantly, reparations is making a moral claim. It's not making a legal claim. And it's also maybe making a financial claim, but again, it's doing so within the context of deep history and far future imaginings. So it's rooted in notions of human rights, the right to autonomy, the right to self-determination, and the right to have previous and present wrongs repaired. So what are some of the remedies? What does reparations look like beyond financial payments? Because financial payments, again, are much more associated with loss and damage. Reparations is maybe more. We've seen some cases come out of courts in some different countries around the world that offer some glimmers of what this could look like. For example, the Urgenda in the Netherlands case in 2015, the court imposed emissions reduction mandates on the government. That's not an immediate financial remedy, but it is a larger form maybe of reparations into the future. In some cases, and I don't know if climate change is the place for this, but in some cases, reparative justice looks like formal apology. It has to do with owning up and accepting wrongs that have been done. What does this all mean for climate policy? I think it's quite complex because it pushes us to think about non-monetary losses that are associated with the emissions. And we're not accustomed to doing that in legal settings and certainly not in financial settings. So we are pushed to have our existing institutions are maybe not well situated to make sense of reparations or reparative justice claims. So we may need to think beyond our existing institutional structure. And I think perhaps the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, can help us here. They offer a bit of a more comprehensive look at how individuals, communities, and countries can thrive, and the 17 dimensions that we now agree as foundational principles that allow us all to succeed and have opportunity and thrive on this planet that we all share. I'll turn this over to Jeff now, who can talk about, I think, the next step in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have a big problem of justice and a big problem of financing, given that countries all over the world, but in a heart-rending way, some of the poorest and most vulnerable countries are facing already very extreme shocks and disruptions, such as the floods, rising sea levels, extreme storms, for, as we all know, something in which their contribution, even on a per-person basis, is minuscule. If you look at estimates of who put the CO2 into the air historically, a conventional estimate that I was just looking at says that per person in the U.S., for the current population of 330 million, there's been an average of 1,250 tons of CO2 emitted cumulatively by the United States in the industrial era. But in Burundi or Chad, it's 1,000 of that. It's basically 1 ton per person. And yet it's Burundi or Chad, which is facing drought, hunger, destitution because of heat waves, droughts, floods, and the other consequences of climate change. If this were in a legal framework and a simpler framework, that you had a rich neighbor and a poor neighbor, and the rich neighbor created damage, pollution that went across the fence to the poor neighbor, there would be a lawsuit. It would be a tort in the United States law. It would be a civil offense. If the rich neighbor polluted a whole neighborhood, it would be called a public nuisance. And that group that was affected could sue the neighbor, you created damage in our neighborhood. And that analogy that poor countries had and have a right to a safe environment, a right, by the way, which has been recognized in UN General Assembly resolutions again this year, but I think is a standing and implicit right, would lead in a simple setting to a claim and reparative justice in the form of some kind of compensation for the trespass that was committed, for the tort that was committed. And this, I think, is a guidance and an analogy to the current situation. Poor people and poor countries need to spend a lot of money to make preventative investments against what's coming. And even with the preventative investments, they're suffering massive losses of life and property as a result of the actions that were taken by the rich countries. And again, if you could have a class action lawsuit where the low-income countries and lower middle-income countries sued the high-emitting countries historically on the same analogy to that neighborhood lawsuit, there would be a way to make a reparative justice or to make a compensation for the damages that were done. We don't have anything like that operating in the international system, because when all of these treaties were negotiated, the powerful countries and the rich countries, that goes together, said, we accept no historical responsibility, and we won't even talk about losses and damages in the context of liability or historical responsibility. So the power structure of the international system is such that poor countries suffer, rich countries give crumbs of aid, so-called, rather than compensation, and the injustices multiply and the harms cannot be faced because the poor countries don't even have the financing for prevention or what we call adaptation, and certainly don't have the financing for adjusting to the actual losses that occur. With Pakistan's flood this year, the estimates made in the days after the floods were on the order of $30 to $50 billion of loss. None of it was insured, and the United States and other countries gave aid afterwards, $10 million, $15 million, $30 million. In other words, on the order of perhaps cumulatively 1% of the actual losses that were incurred from the floods. No justice whatsoever, and you're supposed to be grateful for the aid, not where is the rest of the money that you owe us for the damages that have been done. I believe we need a systematic approach to looking at historical responsibility and two major kinds of costs that arise from the history of emissions. One is the adaptation costs to adjust to a warming climate, and the other is for the losses and damages that are incurred even after optimum adjustment and adaptation spending is made. And so I would like us in academia and in the public processes to try to make these assessments as if we were in a court of law, as if we were trying to understand who is responsible for what and who needs help. Of course, reparative justice is not the only kind of justice. We also have social justice more broadly that Lisa was discussing, and we have rich countries and poor countries. We have other kinds of historical responsibilities. After all, Africa was basically under colonial rule for a century, and before that was under the depredations of slavery and slave raiding and other kinds of exploitation of resources. There's a lot to rectify in an unfair world and a lot of past history, but I don't think we should go on. Let me say it that way. We can go on, we will go on, but we shouldn't go on without taking into account the responsibility for the dire crisis that the world faces right now. And it's time for the rich countries, even as Lisa said, to say we're sorry. They don't come close to saying that. They don't acknowledge any responsibility. I'd like to go further than sorry. When you have that card that says sorry, I'd like a check in it also. And the check would be to help cover the costs of adaptation and losses and damages. And I think we could put some quantified boundaries on the scale of such transfer payments that are needed right now. And they can be levied against the estimates of cumulative CO2 emissions, at least since 1992, when we signed the Framework Convention, maybe since 1896, when Svante Arrhenius told us how we were going to warm by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. We can choose the timeline of what is fair and what is equitable, but we should face up to some degree of historical responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Sachs. And I want to thank all of you on the panel, and thank you so much also, Professor Dale, for extrapolating, explaining the difference between loss and damage and climate reparations. And I really do think the moral aspect of doing what's right is a really interesting thing to look at, for sure. And I think that is going to about wrap it up for us. I want to offer a special thanks as well to Sustainable Population Australia, and also, of course, Columbia University for helping to bring these two wonderful bright minds to help us understand more about the situation and the climate crisis. So thank you all so very much.